Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you Monday to Friday on CGTN. Today we are going to discuss the ever-changing United States. What's wrong with the traditional American values? President Donald Trump's ambition to make America great again has spread unilateralism and protectionism far across the U.S. border. This has triggered geopolitical conflicts like the ongoing trade war between China and the U.S. What is missing between China and the U.S. policymakers? I recently sat down with William Cohen, former U.S. Secretary of Defense. He's Republican, but worked for the Clinton administration. With his unique charisma, he's still well respected by both parties on the Capitol Hill. Before our interview, take a look at this.
War on protectionism continues. The Chinese government has released a white paper about the trade relationship between China and the U.S. Monday. It provided figures to demonstrate how bilateral trade has been mutually beneficial and reiterated the importance of mutual trust and cooperation. The document accuses the Trump administration of abandoning international trade norms of mutual respect and equal consultations, and of preaching unilateralism, protectionism, and economic hegemony. The white paper concluded that China will continue to define its position on the situation, saying economic globalization is an international trend and that trade protectionism goes against the current. Also on Monday, Trump's threatened tariffs on another $200 billion worth of Chinese imports took effect, escalating a trade war between the world's top two economies. The two countries have already slapped tariffs of $50 billion worth of each other's goods earlier this year. New import duties imposed by the U.S. this year affect roughly half of Chinese exports to the United States, with American consumers set to bear the brunt. Trump has hit 12% of total U.S. imports this year alone. Defiant in the face of increasing fears about the impact on the U.S. economy, Trump has threatened to go after all imports from China if the country refuses to change policies he says harm the U.S. industry. Various radical policies made by President Trump have caused widespread controversy and opposition inside the U.S. government. In recent years, the political landscape in the U.S. has become more fractured, polarized, and volatile. The polarization within U.S. politics is also reflected in divided opinions towards Sino-U.S. ties.
When you look at the near picture,
yes,
the long term could always be beautiful because we don't have to deal with them right now. But the near-term future seems to be a little bit worrisome. Strategies coming from both sides, we don't know, but what do you think could be some of the options, rather, that the two sides can look at?
Well, there are a number of things.
Alongside, that I heard.
There are a number of things that we can do. What has happened with respect to our relationship? We have stood, I think, I speak from many Americans, stood in awe of what the Chinese people have been able to achieve in such a very short time. Awe and admiration. Also some envy and jealousy and resentment. The resentment has come about and because there is a sense on the part of the people who have lost out. In terms of globalization has been successful in lifting millions of Chinese people and others all over the world up out of poverty. So there have been many winners. And the Chinese people like to talk win-win solutions. Well, with globalization, there's also winners and losers. And so the people who have lost their jobs, lost their futures, lost their hope, have been feeding on the resentment and pointing fingers. And so these are the folks who now have been politically active, that President Trump is looking to for his, quote, base support. And we have ignored them in the past. That's both Republicans and Democrats have said, well, we're more interested in promoting globalization, and we haven't really focused on their needs. And so the question is, in the future, as we go forward, how do we address those issues? But getting back to what can we do, there is a sense that the system is out of balance right now.
Which system?
Our current trading system.
I see.
President Trump has identified the problem, but he's come up with the wrong, I think, the wrong solution.
Which is tariffs.
Which is tariffs. I don't know many people in the business, certainly in the business of understanding trade, who believe that tariffs are a good thing, that a tariff war is a positive thing. Both countries and both peoples will lose out. There is a way to try to look at structural reform, however, and that would mean, why don't American companies or Western companies have the same opportunity to come into China and buy Chinese companies? Chinese companies, and we have represented some of them, come into the United States and they can buy American companies with some questions about...
But that is not likely to be ironed out for the negotiation coming up.
Not for immediately, but within the near term, that can be done.
But near term is important, Secretary Cohen, as you may know. If the atmosphere keep on getting ever worse, of course, even 200 billion is not necessarily going to be that big a number when it comes to the size of the economy of both countries, but it certainly indicates how the relationship will be shaped in a way for the future. That is what is important right now.
That is true. And the next 2 months are not going to be dispositive on that issue. So what I'm saying is you can have a different trading arrangement with American companies and buying Chinese companies. Also this notion of reciprocity. Alibaba is one of your top companies. They can operate in the United States. Apple Pay can operate here. How come? So there are things that can be done.
Huawei cannot operate with the 5G network in the United States. Neither does ZTE. How come? That is also the question coming from the Chinese side.
ZTE has, in fact, been allowed to continue to operate. Thank you, President
However,
Trump.
there has been a special representative coming from the U.S. side into the Chinese company. That has been a big debate in China as well.
Now, if you keep contradicting me, you see, that's the problem with the United States and China. You're very good.
Debate is good, Mr. Secretary Cohen.
It's very good, and you're very good. But in the short term, very little will probably change. I think following the midterm elections, you may see a change in the composition of Congress. That might make a difference. I'm not saying it will, but I think most people understand that trade wars are not good for us, not good for you, or not good for us. And I think there still will be a core group of people who will see to it that the two biggest economies in the world cannot collide with each other and either then survive and prosper in a way they otherwise could. So I think we'll have to make compromises. I think certainly that is why we are here. That is why Chinese delegations have been coming to Washington. I hosted one of them before I came. So we're going to try our best to say that we have our differences. We can make changes in the way we do business to make it fairer in terms of more balance so that American companies can feel they're receiving reciprocal treatment and China can feel the same way about coming to the United States. But we have to make a commitment to do that. That's just on the trade issues. Then there's something called the military. Military can upset everything. If we don't resolve military differences, strategic differences, then all of the talk about more trade, balanced trade, is really for naught in the event there's a conflict between the United States.
As you may know much better than I do when you're in Washington, that there are those who are already talking about some of the fundamental interests which has been laid out there from the very beginning of the bilateral relations. For example, about Taiwan, about some of the other sensitive issues between China and the United States. Use that as a bargaining chip. That, you may know, is a very dangerous road to walk ahead. Secretary Cohen, many people ask here, really, how many of those in the decision-making process about China-U.S. relations right now, in the White House or in Washington as a whole, really know much about what China-U.S. has gone through in order to be where we are? On the other hand, do they have listening ears to words coming from you, for example, and some of the others who understand fundamentally how this relationship is working?
Again, it comes back to part of the problem that we have in the United States. There is not a deep bench, so to speak, of knowledge of China, its history, its culture, its interests. Many of those who are knowledgeable have been relegated to, quote, elite, and therefore not to be trusted. That's something that we have an obligation to overcome, that we have to persuade the American people that, no, knowledge is a good thing. It's not something to be denigrated. Having cultural exchanges, cultural knowledge of each other is a good thing. One of your leaders, Wang Shishan, is fond of quoting Mark Twain. And he said that travel makes narrow-mindedness impossible. So it's really important that members of Congress and leaders travel to various countries, and China in particular, to understand the history of China, its culture, its interests, and what it sees as its vision for the future.
But what if some believe in Thucydides' trap? Meaning, when the rising power, incumbent power, definitely to have a war, and therefore, no matter what we do, the Chinese are going to take away what we had, and it's going to be called the so-called imbalance, the American way. And therefore, these kind of, discussions, it's not going to function at all.
Well, isn't that...
If that is the fundamental belief of some.
Yeah, but isn't that the burden of a knowledge society, is to say that we know history, we know what has happened in history, we know that the history and the arc of history of mankind has been more warfare than less. And so can we learn that there have been studies done out of the 16 major studies of the Thucydides trap as such, 12 of the 16 ended up in war. In warfare in with today's technology, simply it's unthinkable. It's possible to do, but it's unthinkable in terms of its consequences. So we depend upon, we've got in our pockets this little device called the iPhone or the Huawei phone or the Samsung phone, whatever it is. We have in this little device all of the knowledge in the world in our hands. So it's really up to us to educate ourselves, to say nothing is inevitable until it happens. And we can prevent the inevitable by making choices now that avoid that trap, that avoid the potential for conflict or the inevitability of conflict. We don't have to have it.
Earlier, you were in the ceremonies remembering what your longtime friend, John McCain, who passed away recently. We understand there has been a lot of debates about exactly the values that are important to America now. What would you say about him and this debate right now going on in your country?
Well, John McCain is one of our heroes. He was heroic in the sense that he was flying during the war in Vietnam, was shot down, was injured badly. He was beaten badly. He spent 5.5 years in prison and was given a chance for early exit out, and he refused. Being true to the code, the last in is the last out. And he said, everybody that came in before me must leave first. And so he achieved heroic proportions in the minds of most people. But then he went on for public service and spent a good deal of his time, some of it in the House of Representatives, then in the Senate. And what he stood for was principle, that we had core values, that we believed in a strong national defense, we believed in balanced budgets, we believed in human rights, we believed in the dignity of individuals. He believed that we had to compromise, that we had to work with our fellow colleagues in the Senate. If they were Democrats who had good ideas, he was willing to work with them. So he reached across the aisle, as we like to say in Washington, was able to work with people of a different philosophical persuasion, but could find common ground.
But we understand he has been having some problems with President Trump personally.
Yes.
And also this has led to further debate about exactly what is the values of Washington these days. Of course, that is what the U.S. internal matter, as the Chinese always say. But what's important is what kind of United States is it presenting to the rest of the world. That is important to us also.
Exactly, and that's why so much world attention was turned on the funeral services for John McCain, because it represented to many something of an era of passing, that we don't have many like him anymore that was willing to stand up for the core values that he represented. And President Trump, of course, had a personal disagreement with John McCain and did not consider him to be a hero. And so that generated a lot of controversy in terms of people who felt that that was really not an appropriate position to take with respect to John. But what's happened in Washington is the parties have become even more polarized. Republicans have moved further and further to the right, As a result, the Democrats are moving further to the left. So what used to be the kind of core middle, of which I like to think I was part of, is disappearing. There's not much left to the middle as such. And the middle represents compromise.
Right.
Compromise is not a four-letter word. It's not a dirty word. It's something, if you believe in the art of government, it means that you have to find common ground with people who have different views.
And compromise is also the key word when it comes to trade negotiations in a way.
It comes to our dealing with China. For example, you have a different philosophy in terms of how you see trade than we do. We can plant our flags in cement and then
never reach an agreement.
Never reach an agreement, never reaching any kind of a consensus saying, we understand what you're trying to achieve, you must understand what we're trying to achieve. How do we come together? That is what needs to be done, and that's why the China Development Forum is so important, that you have people coming. Unfortunately, we're classified as the elite. I come from pretty humble background, and yet it's part of the American dream, and I would suggest it's part of the Chinese dream as well. And that is, you give people the opportunity to be the best that they can be.
Right.
So you can come from very humble beginnings and rise to the top. That's what we call the American dream. Barack Obama was a classic case of that. Who would have thought that someone of his background could be President of the United States? And so I think it's true of the Chinese people as well. And as you know, I give a lecture every year at Nankai University.
That's right.
And I look at those students and I say, you can be whatever you want to be.
I remember last time our conversation is about leadership when it comes to the end. And I would pose the same question to you now, because things have been really changing since last time we talked. So Secretary Cohen, being considered as a great leader when you were serving for the administration earlier, what do you think should be the qualities of leadership these days in Washington, and if you can, also in Beijing?
Well, number one, knowledge. Number two, understanding. Number three, humility. And four, willing to reach agreement with someone or some country that may not share your entire viewpoint.
Secretary Cohen, always wonderful to talk to someone who is such an open-minded leader.
You're always a challenge to deal with.
That's our exclusive interview with William Cohen, former U.S. Secretary of Defense in the Clinton administration, who's also a Republican.